And we are back at the Productivity Show. Hey, this is Tan. I'm founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life.
And I'm Brooks, so I'm the operations director and the wearer of many hats and the Productivity Show co-host. We're super excited to have you all here with us, listening to us.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about annual reviews and why they're so important. But one of the things we always like to do before we kick off the episode is to share some of our favorite resources. So Brooks, what are your top 3 favorite resources as of lately?
All right, so my top 3 resources I like to cover today is one that's super popular in our wider community, the Asian efficiency community. People recommend it all the time, and it's Phrase Express. So it's available on Windows, Mac, Android, iOS. It's similar to Text Expander if you are familiar with that tool. That's a tool we talk about all the time, but it also does quite a bit more things as well. So Phrase Express, if you need that a really cross-platform functionality, Phrase Express is a really popular one. Number 2 is an FC pocket folding utility knife, which is kind of like the box knives that we've talked about before, but on the podcast. But this is a really heavy-duty version of it, and it folds up. So if you're somebody who opens a ton of boxes, maybe you're like all about the Amazon ordering, this pocket knife is a really popular one. And third, one I know Tan recommended to me, and I used it on my train trip across Russia, Mongolia, and China, is the Manta sleep mask. So it's a super comfortable sleep mask, really soft, really kind of forms to your face, and it has really great blackout capabilities. So it made a great difference for the sleep for me on my trip, and I'm looking forward to use it on future trips too.
Yeah, that's a great sleep mask. I recently discovered it too and highly recommend it. So thank you, Brooks, for sharing your favorite resources as of lately. So now let's kick off the episode here. So one of the things that I think is so important and crucial for accomplishing goals and making sure that you're always improving the way you're succeeding at life and just crushing your goals is to do an annual review. Now, some of you who are listening to this episode, you might be thinking, man, I've never heard of this term before. What is an annual review? Well, you're about to discover why this is so important for accomplishing your goal for 2020. Now, maybe you are somebody who has heard of the term annual review, but you've never really done it. And if that is you, we're going to give you some tools and a framework that you can follow to make this really successful. And if you're somebody who has done an annual review, before, but maybe you're not sure if you're doing it right, or maybe you have a lot of success already, one of the things that we're going to share with you is like a really simple tip that you can implement. And we're going to share some of the insights that we've had since last year when we did this episode on the same topic. And that alone can change everything for you. It will make you more effective. It will make you more efficient. And so there's a little bit of everything for everybody here today. And Brooks, when it comes to doing an annual review, this is something you and I do very often, but why do we actually do them?
Well, the power of the annual review is it helps you set better goals for the upcoming year, because if you think about it, how are you going to know what you want to do next year if you don't have a good idea of what worked and what didn't work this year? Some goals you're going to want to carry over, some you're going to want to actually build on, and some you will realize, oh, this is something I should be focusing on. And by looking back at the year you just had, it really helps you make more relevant goals for the future year. And you can look back, and another thing is you can see how you've grown over the past year. So this is one thing that's really helpful for an annual review. I think all of us suffer from recency bias, where if we think to ourselves, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, but we think to ourselves, oh, how did the year go? And we kind of have an idea, and maybe we feel like, oh, I didn't accomplish as much as I thought I would. But if you go back and actually look at the year objectively, you might be surprised at how far you've come and where you actually were back in January or February. So really, an annual review is the best way for you to know whether the year is successful or not, without just relying on your opinion at that moment at the end of the year. So that's what an annual review is really powerful for. One thing we do want to say, which an annual review is not necessarily just specifically for, which is just getting ready for New Year's resolutions. We're not talking about New Year's resolutions here. We're talking about getting a more objective and complete view of the year you just had.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you're about to enter a new relationship and you didn't learn from your past relationships. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to make the same mistakes. You're not going to be the best boyfriend, girlfriend that you could be because you're making the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? And this is oftentimes true for our personal goals as well. So what if you were actually going to look back and say, oh man, what did I do wrong from my past relationships? What did I do right? And what should I continue to do? Right? So when you start looking at that way, you can enter a new relationship as a new person that's better off, and you know exactly what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And it's the same thing with goals, right? So before you start thinking about what your new goals are going to be and how you're going to tackle them, it's going to be worthwhile to think about, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well, and how can I improve upon this? And once you are armed with that kind of information and insight, then your success rate goes up for whatever goal you want to accomplish next. And that's why the annual review, I think, is so important, because you basically set aside an intention to really learn what happened over the past, let's say, 11 or 12 months or so. Right? And if you skip this process, then what ends up happening for most people is that you set the same New Year's resolution every single year, right? And if you've been following the Productivity Show for a while, you know that we don't necessarily believe in New Year's resolutions, but a lot of people still do, right? And that's why we have to bring it up. And the average person does maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 times the same intention. They set the same New Year's resolution for 4 or even 7 years in a row. And that's actually kind of bad when you think about that, right? And if you had any sort of annual review in place, then you would not have to do this every single year, because guess what? You would have learned from your mistakes. You would have figured out, okay, this doesn't work, this does, so I need to change, adjust, or replicate whatever is working, right? So
Yeah, not only that, but a lot of times we don't even realize that we're making the same intentions and goals every single year, because we don't think back that far. So we just think, oh, what do I want to focus on this year? Oh, okay, I'm going to focus on X, Y, and Z. But if we did our annual review and were consistent in that, we would recognize that pattern right away, and then you can adjust course. So that's why looking back is good, because you actually have information to make those decisions for the next year.
yeah, you don't want to be the person that says, okay, I want to lose 20 pounds this year, and then next year you go, I want to lose 45 pounds, right? It's not, it's technically not the same goal, but it's the same idea, right? So we don't want to be that person. So when it comes to conducting an annual review, there's 3 tools you really need, right? And again, we covered this back in TPS 227. So you can go to theproductivityshow.com/227 to revisit that episode. And we go into very much detail of how to conduct your annual review with those 3 tools. And we'll repeat some of the stuff here today, but I think it's worthwhile to listen back to that episode. So theproductivityshow.com/227, or if you're listening in a podcast app, just scroll down a little bit further until you hit maybe like December 2018 or so, and you'll start to see that podcast episode there. So 227. And so the 3 tools that we recommend you use is 1, a journal, 2, an accomplishment list, and then 3, a failure list. So we'll go over all 3 tools here today, and we'll have more in-depth episodes for each and every one of them as well. But the biggest one, again, is TPS 227. So you definitely want to check out that episode if you haven't yet. So let's start with the first tool, Brooks, and that is a journal. So why do you journal? Why do we recommend a journal?
Yeah, so we did a deep dive into journaling in TPS 154. Like Tam mentioned, we do a deep dive into more of these things. And when you hear about the journal, and I bet if you go back in that episode, we'll say this as well, is the benefits you usually hear about with a journal are it helps you decompress, it helps you get thoughts out of your head, it helps you eliminate stress, clarify your thinking, make better decisions. All that is absolutely true about a journal. However, what's really relevant to us in this scenario of making our annual review is it helps you keep track to achieve your goals. So it helps you keep track and keep yourself accountable to whether you're actually taking action on your goals and where you are with working on your goals. Because like we said, if you think to yourself, okay, how was 2019? And you might think, oh, it was good. March was a little rough. Maybe April was fine. But if you look back in a journal and see what you were doing in March and April and February and January, you actually have the real truth, what was going on, and not just what you think was going on in December. So you have this record of what you were doing, and if you're journal this type of thing, what you were thinking. And this is really, really helpful for creating this annual review because you have all this material there. Your past self was really, really helpful to you in your present self, and giving you all this material that now you can use to build a much better annual review because you actually have your thinking.
It's kind of like, instead of thinking about what actually happens and what your interpretation of it is, or maybe your story or your vision or your version, the journal is kind of like an objective measurement, because it basically has a documentation piece of everything that happened that day or that particular week. And so you take out any sort of, story behind it, or whatever version you have of what happened, and you just start to look at what actually happened. So it's kind of like separating facts from stories. And this is why a journal is so helpful. And I used to think that journaling was just, something high school girls would do, right? It was just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go home and write in my journal and just write down my thoughts. And um, man, I was so wrong. Like, this is super helpful for all the reasons you mentioned: making better decisions, just helping relax. One of the best ways to kind of like improve your sleep is to journal before you sleep, because you can just close all these open loops in your head and just eliminate a lot of stress that way. And then go to bed, and you'll start to see that your REM sleep probably goes up quite a bit when you do that. So that's something that a lot of people don't know, but is really beneficial as well. But when it comes to conducting your annual review, one of the things that we talk about in episode 227, like I mentioned before, is that you essentially want to go through your whole journal before you start thinking and planning what you're going to do next. And as you're going to go through your journal, you'll start to see patterns. You'll start to see, oh, I'm thinking the same negative thoughts for some reason. Why am I even thinking this today? Like, it makes no sense. Like, I should stop doing that. Or you start to see some of the mistakes that you've made, and you start to be able to figure out, okay, why am I making this mistake? Maybe there's a better way to go about this, right? And you start to see all these different patterns and solutions that you can that you can address and then fix. And there's no way you can get this insight without having some sort of record. And this is why we love journaling. And so you can apply this to any goal that you have, whether it's, related to relationships, your fitness, business, money. You can literally apply this concept of reading a journal and then figuring out, how do I apply this to my goal? And whether it is, something related to your business or something to your personal life, this is pretty much universal. So don't worry about boxing yourself into a particular category. This is your life. You can choose and decide how you want to live your life. And having that journal makes it just worthwhile to not only document, but you're going to be so glad 2-3 years from now when you reread that journal and you go, wow, I can't believe I was so upset about that relationship that I was in. I'm so glad I'm not in that relationship anymore, right? But in that moment, you can't really think clear when you're in that spot. But looking back, you can see, oh man, I've grown so much. I've moved on from this relationship, or I can't believe I had all this self-doubt about myself. And look where I am today, right? And when you can see that growth in yourself, it gives you a lot of confidence, and it gives you a lot of insight of how you operate and think. And going forward, it makes it a lot easier for you to adjust and do what works best for you.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that about going back and rereading things, because this is actually something that I think a lot of people, even people who do journal, a lot of people don't do, is actually go back and read what it is that they wrote. And there are still a lot of benefits from even if you do that, even if you never go back and read your stuff, there are still a lot of benefits, like we talked about, being more calm, getting things out of your head, sleeping better, which we're going to get to in a bit. And I'm starting to see some connections here. But if you don't go back and read what you wrote, you don't get the full benefit of having that journal, and it really helps you also evaluate decisions that you made. So if you're even a work thing, if you were trying to decide on some situation back in February, now in December you can look back and say, hey, did I make the right decision? Is there something I can learn from that decision that I made? And then you can apply it there. So definitely, even if you are a journaler, I hope we've kind of convinced you the benefit of going back and rereading what it is that you did when you're making your annual review. Now, Tan, how are you journaling these days? Because a lot of times we all like to hear the tactics of what we all do. So, are you an electronic journaler, or how do you actually do your journals?
Yeah, this is something I've covered in detail in episode TPS 154. So again, you can go to theproductivityshow.com/154. And one of the things that I had to figure out over time was just experimenting with different tools, like having blank sheets of paper, having a physical journal, then using something like Day One. Or if you're really old school, there was a great app called Mac Journal, which is now extinct. And I have to like export all that data out to make sure I maintain all my records. But I've tried all sorts of different tools, and I just keep going back to the physical notebook, right? So for the first many years, I just had a blank notebook that I used, and I just wrote in it, and it was nothing special, right? No special productivity journal or plan or anything like that. It was just like a blank notebook that I bought for like $4.99 at Target or something, and I just kept writing in it. And um, I just find that when I write it with my pen on a piece of paper, it's just way more relaxing, because if I journal at night when I'm in bed, for example, before I go to sleep, it's like the light just keeps me awake. Even I have the blue blocking glasses on. It's just really distracting because, I have iMessage on my computer, and then if I see a red icon appear, I'm like, oh no, I gotta check this because it has to be inbox 0, and then you go, and off this tangent, right? And then also I associate my laptop with working, not really with creative or just non-work stuff, and so I don't want to create that relationship either. And so that's why I just continue to come back to the blank notebook.
So what you're saying is, if you want to have an effective journal and use it for annual review, you don't have to like fly in some special notebook from Japan with some sort of special acid-free paper or anything like that. Anything will work. Is that what you're saying here?
Man, that $4.99 Target notebook lasted me a good thing.
So here's the funny thing about or unfortunate, I guess you could say, the thing about my journaling is, partway through this year, I actually stopped journaling, and it wasn't a totally intentional choice. I was redoing my morning routine, and I was kind of like rejiggering things, and then I kind of decided to try it without journaling for a while, and then as we've talked about here on the Productivity Show a lot, I got out of the habit, and I was curious what the annual review process is going to be like having done that. And I can tell you that it was a mistake. So I'm going to be real here on the podcast. So this is definitely something I'm going to be changing, well, now, but also for 2020, is it makes it much more difficult to do a annual review if you don't have a journal. And we're going to talk about some things you can do if you don't have a journal and have the three things we are talking about. But take it my word for it. Do not stop journaling, and definitely whatever you can do to get those thoughts and things that are going on paper or digital. I used Day One for that, but I did it in the morning, not the night. It will definitely help you out. So definitely keep journaling.
Yeah, and this is something, again, we talked in detail in episode 227. So definitely go check that out. So if you don't have a journal right now, or you haven't journaled at all this year, Brooks, you can go back to that episode too and see what you need to do there.
We record these episodes live with our dojo audience and on camera, and you'll just have to take my word for it. I'm sliding down in my chair off the camera.
It kind of reminds me of that Homer Simpson meme where he goes
That's
into
right.
that little bush and he's like, "Nope,
Slowly,
I'm
yeah,
out."
I'm out of here. Anyway, that is journaling. So TLDR version, journaling is better for an annual review. But why don't we move on to the number 2 thing? And number 2 and number 3 are actually things I learned from your process, Tan. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about this. And number 2 is keeping an accomplishment list. So what kind of makes up your accomplishment list? How do you keep it? And how does it help you with an annual review?
So I have a note in Evernote that is simply called Accomplishment List 2019, since that is this year. So I have a list for every single year. And in my OmniFocus, I have a recurring task every Sunday, and it's kind of part of my weekly review to write down any sort of accomplishment I've had in that particular week. So I don't keep it on a daily record. I like to do it on a weekly basis. And then I literally just write down anything that I consider an accomplishment. It could be something really small, could be something really big, but anything that comes to my mind as an accomplishment could be as such, right? And it could be something as simple as I ate a salad today, or I didn't want to go to the gym, but I still went, right? Or could be something even more significant, like I got all my work done before noon, or I hosted a party last night and was a great success, or I attended this workshop and I learned a lot. I visited Europe. I went through this country, and you can just literally write down whatever you want to write down, right? And the reason this list is so powerful is because most of the time when you sit down in December and you go, "Oh, what went well this year?" you only remember the really big things that happened that year, right? So maybe you got married. Maybe you got divorced. Maybe that is an accomplishment. I don't know, right? Maybe you lost like 50 pounds by that particular date, right? And these are all great accomplishments, and these are worthwhile celebrating. But there's so many accomplishments that you've had since then that you probably just don't even remember. And to illustrate this example, at Asian Efficiency, we follow Scrum, right? And we have this cycle where every 2 weeks we start an initiative. We say, hey, this is all we're going to do this sprint, right? And then it usually lasts about 2 weeks. And then by the end of it, we'll all come together and say, hey, what went well? What didn't go so well? What could we do better next time? And kind of demo some stuff, what we created, what we adjusted and changed. We start to kind of like showcase what we worked on. And then there's a lot of learning that we do in that meeting as well. And we've been doing this for, I don't know, like over 5 years now. And the same truth keeps appearing every single time. And that is, if we wait until the last 24 hours of adding our notes to the retro board or the retrospective, we don't get as many feedback items compared to if I tell the team, hey, I need you to update this board every single week, right? Or every other day or so. And you can clearly see a difference in the number of notes that are posted when somebody does only, or when we as a team only post notes 24 hours before we have the meeting versus just every other day or at least once a week. And that is because we just simply forget everything that we've done. Whether it's positive or negative, right? And we see this in our sprint retrospectives all the time. So one of Marmel's jobs is to continuously remind the team members to say, hey, be sure to add, your notes as well. And then we have like Slack reminders now too. And because it's so important, because if we don't even know what happened in the last 2 weeks, imagine trying to remember what happened over the past 12 months, right? So having a running list of all your accomplishments is so crucial because if you do it on a weekly basis at a minimum, you'll just start to note down all these little things that you can celebrate. And by the end of the year, when you start looking back at your year and you go over your accomplishment list, for some years, for me, it's been like over 50 things. For some years, it's been over 120. But there's no magic number. But it can be again, anything. And when you start to review your year, you start to see, oh, wow, I ate a salad for 3 days in a row back in February. I, back in 2018, I had never done that before, right? Like I actually did, but I'm just, illustrating this as an example, right? And so you start to see, oh, wow, I did these things, I did that, and it was like, oh, this is actually a pretty good year, even though maybe you got divorced that year, and that was like really depressing, right? And understandably so. But if you look at everything else that happens, you go, wow, I've had over 100 accomplishments, some big, some small. And in comparison to the one big negative thing that happened this year, it's actually a pretty good year. And we oftentimes don't give ourselves enough credit, right? So that's why having a accomplishment list is so powerful.
Yeah, this can even be helpful even throughout the year, if you even not at the annual review time, because if you're just having a bad week or a bad day, you have that list that you can dip into, and you can see, oh yeah, even though I'm like super frustrated right now, look at all these other, or maybe I messed something up at this particular day. Hey, I can look at all these other things and be like, hey, I actually do kick butt. So it's really, really helpful. It's also really helpful in a work setting to have this list. And this is something I used to do, especially back in my corporate days, because a lot of times you're meeting with your boss for your annual review or quarterly review or whatever, and a lot of times your raise can be heavily interviewed by this review that you're having with them. And if you keep throughout the year a list of your accomplishments, it gives you a lot more ammunition to be to advocate for yourself, because no one is going to advocate for you as much as you are. And trust me, just like Tan, what you were saying with the sprint and us trying to remember things to put on the retrospective, no matter how much you think you're going to remember something in that moment, you are not going to remember that when it comes to year end. It's only going to be the really big things that you remember. It doesn't matter how happy you are on March 23rd because something awesome happened. You're not going to remember that later. So having this accomplishment list really can positively impact your career as well. So highly, highly recommended if you're in a workplace as well.
So, Brooks, what are some of the things that maybe you have written down as part of your accomplishment list?
Yeah, so some of the things that I wrote down are mostly, or not mostly, but a lot of travel related things, like traveling to more non-English speaking countries, doing more solo travel. These are things I wanted to do, and so I was able to knock those off. Also, financial goals. So we had, as a family, we had some financial goals for kids' education and stuff like that, and we were managed to be a bit ahead of that. So I wrote that down, and it was a lot of those. Type of personal goals, also goals with the podcast. We hit a certain number of downloads, which we're really, really thankful for. So thank you for listening. Yeah, it was those types of things that I wrote down. How about you?
Makes me feel really good that these bonuses I've been giving you has been very helpful in that sense.
That's right. That's right. My kids will thank you someday.
All these little elements of tan in your journals makes me very happy. Hashtag narcissist.
That's right. I could be taking my wife out for dinner, but no, I just right into the RASP.
It's totally off topic, but I've been learning a lot about narcissism as of lately, and it's a really interesting phenomenon because this is something a lot of people have not talked about really until the last few years or so. But that's a completely different topic. So you and I will chat about that when you're in Austin next time.
Sounds good.
But when it comes to my accomplishment list, like I said, it could be really simple things like, I went to the gym even though I didn't feel like it. That's a very recurring theme in my accomplishment list. It's like, there's a lot of times I don't want to do something and I still did it. And I know you have those moments too where you're like, oh man, I really don't want to work out today. And then you went, and you're like, hell yeah, I went. I'm so happy I did that. Right. And the fact that you wrote that down makes you go, oh yeah, I remember that moment. Like that actually felt really good. And once I kind of realized that, and I was reading through some of that stuff today, I was like, oh man, like I'm going to go to the gym tomorrow. So I know even if I don't feel like it, the fact that it happened before and I did it, I know that I can do it again. Right. So it kind of gives you that level of confidence. Right. Another simple thing was like I had bone broth 3 days in a row, which is something I'm super excited about, right? Super healthy and all that good stuff. Hosted at least 5 parties this year, which I'm really excited about. Took a lot of work and attended a bunch of workshops, visited different friends in different cities, slept for 10 hours one day or one night, I should say. Like, you know, for most people, like sleeping 10 hours is like, mission impossible. But for me, I wouldn't say it's a very common thing. I do it maybe once every few weeks or so. But the fact that I did that was really good for me. And I wanted to remember that and celebrate that. So I wrote that down. Right. So again, these can be really small things that might seem insignificant to others, but maybe it's a big deal to you. Right. So sleeping 10 hours was a big deal to me because I needed that to recover for whatever reason. And so whatever you write down, this is your list. Don't worry about what other people think of it. Nobody else is really going to read it. This is just for you, right? So another thing I wrote down is like I tried certain dishes for the first time, and I'm like, okay, I'm glad I tried it. I like that, but I didn't like that. Now I know, right? And so whatever comes to your mind, I would just recommend that you create a recurring task in your to-do list, right? So in my case, I have OmniFocus, and then I have a recurring task as part of my weekly review to kind of update that list. And literally it takes like 5 seconds, right? And sometimes it might take like a minute, and that would be a really awesome week. But usually it's like 5 seconds, like, yeah, I did that. Okay, cool. Let's write that down. If nothing happens, that's fine too. You just move on, right? So that is an accomplishment list.
All right. So now that we've built ourselves up, we're super great. We've accomplished a lot of things in 2019. As we mentioned, the third activity that we do, the third tool that really helps you with an annual review, we're going to break ourselves down now, and that is the failure list, which does sound depressing, but it's really important to have a balanced view so that you can grow. The purpose of it isn't to like make yourself depressed or feel bad about what happened throughout the year. It doesn't have to be like that at all. It's more just so you have these opportunities that you can grow, and this is a lot of times where the goal is, because you can kind of have a lot of things you can take action on in the next year. And if you don't review these things and if you don't track these things, you can totally forget about them. The way we forget about positive things, you can just as easily forget about those negative things, and then you won't take any action to improve them the next year.
Most of us learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. And I think that's why it's so crucial that you keep a failure list, like a running list of things that you consider failures. And again, they can be really small and they can be really big. Most of us remember the big things, right? Oh, I didn't hit this particular deadline and then I got penalties or fees or something, right? I didn't file my taxes on time or something like that, right? But then there's smaller ones too. For example, you said, maybe to a friend, hey, let me call you tomorrow, and then you didn't end up calling that person, right? And maybe you called them the next day or something, right? To me, that would also be considered a failure, because to me, if I promise something and I didn't do it, that to me is a failure, right? It's not belittling me. It's not trying to make me feel bad. It's just this matter of fact to me. Like, I said I would do this and I didn't do it. That's a failure to me, right? Where I said I want to accomplish X, I didn't do it. That's a failure to me too, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean that I am terrible, that I suck, or anything like that. It's just a matter of fact, right? So that's how I look at failure. And so some of the examples that I've written down would be stuff like, okay, I said I would water my plants every single week, and there were weeks where I didn't do that, right? So that would be a failure as well. And once I wrote that down multiple times, I went, oh man, I'm terrible at watering my plants every week. What do I need to change? And I basically started to create a recurring task in my OmniFocus to do this. And now it's part of my Sunday routine to kind of do it, right? And so I relied on my memory, and I should have learned from that, because relying on our memory is a terrible idea. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that that's a terrible idea. And I had to relearn that lesson myself. But I didn't notice that until I start really journaling and keeping up this failure list. When I realized, oh yeah, I'm making the same mistake. Let me adjust this, right? And so so that's something I did. Another thing is there were multiple times, especially since 2018, but this year too, where I said, okay, I'm going to fast for X amount of hours. So let's say 36 hours. But then the last time I did it, I only committed to or doing 20 hours, right? So that's a failure as well. And I wrote that down too, and I started to realize, oh, this has happened multiple times. Like, how is this different from the other times when I did fast for 36 hours? What's the difference, right? Is it what I ate before? Did I prepare for this? Or did I use my Zero app, which is the tracking app that I use? Like, what's the difference there? And then I start poking and realize, oh, I realized the times when I succeed at fasting versus when I failed is whether I use the app or not for tracking the time. If I do it mentally and said, okay, I fasted or started fasting at 6 o'clock last night, it's not the same level of commitment versus actually pushing a button on my app, right? Also, if I ate a bunch of carbs or sugary foods before I start fasting, that's always a terrible idea because it makes it so much more difficult, right? So what you eat before you start fasting makes a big difference too, right? And these are all things I learned and picked up because I looked at my failure list and I thought, oh, this is the same thing happening again, right? Or as I was updating, I noticed like this has happened multiple times now. Like I need to think about this some more, right? Other things would be some stuff like I said I would post these photos of my dinner party the next day, and then I didn't post it until a week later, right? And that's a failure too. And then I started to figure out, okay, this has happened multiple times now. Like, what do I do to fix this, right? And so you start to see there's this mindset of like Kaizen, like continuous improvement, right? And this is one of our big core values, Brooks, as you know, just always looking for ways to do things better and making process improvements and just tweaks that lead to big results and big changes, right? So now that I'm watering my plants every single week on time, guess what? No more dead plants, right? Alive plants. My place looks awesome. And I don't have to buy new plants every quarter or so, right? So that saves me money over time as well, right? The same thing for fasting. Now that I'm a little bit more consistent, my hormones are more in check. My body weight is healthier more than ever. And same thing with the photos. Now that I, can post the photos on time because now I have a process improvement, people perceive me as reliable, right? If Tan says something, he will actually do it, right? So he lives up to his word. And so there's all these different impacts and changes that you make from just looking at your failure list and trying to figure out, okay, what can I do to make this better? And there will be failures on there that are only one-time events, and that's totally fine too. But if you see something that's recurring, that's an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, and a lot of times we think of the word failure and we think of it as being some big thing that is a big problem. It doesn't have to be. Like if you fast 20 hours versus 36 hours, or if you post pictures, whatever, 3 days later or a week later instead of the next day, it's not like it's a huge deal in the grand scheme of things. However, it is all things that is good to note down so that, like you said, you can see if it's pattern. So don't take the word failure to be this big epic thing or even something that's like causing a big problem in your life. It's all about, like you said, that Kaizen thing where you just fix these little things, and over time these small little mistakes that you fix can lead to big improvements over time. It doesn't always have to be the big things. For me, one of the real themes for me, which I didn't make the connection until you just said it here on the podcast about maybe 20 minutes ago, is I've always been a master sleeper. Like it drives my wife crazy because she's never been the greatest sleeper. It always takes her a long time to go to sleep. Whereas I've always been like, I'm asleep before my head hits the pillow. But for whatever reason this year, most of this year, my sleep has not been good. It's taken me a long time to go to sleep. I've woken up in the night and all that sort of stuff. And I never made the connection that maybe it's also really, maybe coincidentally, is when I had said I had stopped journaling this year. So I'm wondering if maybe that's related in some way. So that is something, but that is something that if I hadn't been kind of on it and noticing this, I may not have made that connection, but I also may not have realized that it's not just me having a bad sleep occasionally, but it's more routine in that. So now I know that this is something that I need to focus on next year, because as we've talked about on the podcast a million times, sleep has such a great impact on productivity. So by having this list of things to improve, it's really, really helped with that.
Ooh, well, that's even a stronger motivation now to get back to journaling and just tracking your sleep and see how that goes.
Yep, but it's also been really helpful, and that's one nice thing about having the dojo, our online community, because we have a lot of resources on sleep, and we've also covered a number of times on the podcast as well. So I can go back, like the Hair Club for Men, I can be a client too, and go back and visit our resources and take action there. Now, one thing that we did want to talk about, and we went into this in a lot of detail in the podcast episode we've been referencing, TPS227. So we're not going to go into this in huge detail right now, but I did want to cover it. And this is a question that Tammy, who's listening on the podcast live, also asked just now, which is, so we've talked about these tools that you want to use, the journal, the accomplishment list, and the failure list, and that's all great, but what happens if you want to do an annual review and you hadn't kept those? Maybe you're going to start next year, but what about if you haven't kept those? And what we have is we have some questions that you can ask yourself in lieu of these lists that can really, really help. And again, we're not going to go in huge detail because we talked about it a lot in that previous podcast, but some questions you want to ask, you can ask yourself is, and these are questions that serve you well in a lot of different areas of your life and work. But ask yourself and just sit down, have a cup of tea beside you, sit down with a pen and paper, and just think to yourself, okay, what went well this year? What didn't go well this year? Why do you think that is? What have I been doing, or what should I start doing? What am I not doing that I should start doing? What am I doing that is really helping and I should keep doing? What am I doing regularly that I should stop doing? What are some reasons why I think I didn't achieve my goals? If you didn't, of course. What things did I learn? What really helped me out? And what's going to make this next year really, really awesome? So if you kind of ruminate, you don't have to do all of those questions, but if you ruminate on enough of those questions and give yourself some time to think, and some more tactical things, you can do things like look back at your calendar for the year and see what sorts of things have been going on. You can look at your task manager and view your completed items. Not that you need to go through every single task you've checked off, but it's more about seeing those bigger projects and just kind of glancing through them. Some memories will trigger. Going through those things and asking yourself those questions can be a pretty good summary, or a pretty good alternative, I should say, for having those journal and accomplishment and failure lists.
And if you're a Dojo member, we also have a live training recording of how to conduct an annual review. So if you are a Dojo member, be sure to log into your portal and search for annual review, and you'll be able to find that training as well. We did that last year. And we go into even more detail, and we share some more exclusive things that we haven't not shared on the podcast yet. So if you're a Dojo member, please log in and go check that out. And if you're not a Dojo member, you can become a member today. And there's a special offer. If you just go to theproductivityshow.com/dojo, you can try it out for just $1 for your first month. So be sure to try that out. Again, that URL is theproductivityshow.com/dojo.
All right. So to recap this episode, what you want to do is when you're wanting to do your annual review, you want to set aside a bunch of time so that you're not disturbed. Of course, you work with the time that you have, but ideally you carve out a lot of time for this so you can really give this some thought, and it's not just surface level. You want to really give it a lot of thought. Go through your entire journal if you have one for the year. I know it sounds like a lot, but you'll get a lot of gold out of it. Go through your failure list and your accomplishments list. Write down your notes of what kind of came to mind as you went through those, and what you can do. Use those insights and work them into your plan for next year. And then summarize your year. We like to have a one-word summary that kind of allows you to describe your year. That can be really helpful as you go back and review your previous years as well. And then if you have that journal, go through the process. If you don't have it, go through some of the questions that we just outlined. Listen to that previous podcast, TPS227. And if you're a Dojo member, go through the training that we did. And yeah, set yourself up for success in the next year by starting your journal, your achievement list, and your failure list, or keep them going if you're already doing them, and use this all to review 2019 and get ready for 2020. All right, we have hit